Connecting Minds is a space dedicated to honoring the amazing authors, researchers, clinicians, artists, and entrepreneurs who are contributing to our collective evolution or simply making the world a better place. These thought-provoking conversations are intended to expand our horizons, so come with an open mind and let us grow together. Here is your host, Christian Yordanov.
Hello and welcome to the Connecting Minds podcast. My name is Christian Yordanov, your host, and I'm very glad you're here with me today. Today on the show we have Dr. Jeremy Weate, who is the CEO of Universal Ibogaine. And the topic of our discussion will be Eboga and Ibogaine and addictions. So in case you didn't know, Ibogaine is the extract from the Eboga plant, which grows in West Africa, in places like Gabon. And it's a sacrament in the Bwiti tradition there. And basically, Ibogaine has tremendous potential to treat addictions. And as someone who has seen firsthand what addictions can do to people, families, larger social groups, this is a cause very near and dear to my heart. So I will support it any way I can. And that is why I was delighted when Jeremy agreed to come on the show. As you may already know, the opiate addiction crisis in North America affects many millions of people. Heroin is just a tiny percentage of that. It's prescription drugs really being the real devastating agent there. And of course, generally what happens in North America steadily spreads to the rest of the world. So Europe and Asia, they will follow suit. They're like, it is already an issue in the UK, for example. And of course, let's not forget other addictions like to stimulants, crack, cocaine, of course, the ubiquitous alcohol, which is ravaging places like UK, Ireland, and then, of course, other addictions. So tremendous potential for this psychoactive substance. A lot of research that still must be done to really understand how it can best be used. What the best protocols are, and of course we'll talk about Universal Ibogaine's plans to do such clinical trials. So this was a great conversation with Jeremy. Flowed really well. He's really knowledgeable on the topic, and just you can see the passion he has for Eboga, Ibogaine, and really helping to bring this sacraments, gifts to the world, which I love. A little bit about our guest, Jeremy Weate. Dr. Jeremy Weate has over 17 years strategic advisory experience, focused on minister-level guidance on the mining sector across 50 projects in over 30 countries in Europe, Africa, Central Asia, and the South Pacific. Jeremy also has a decade-long interest in the medicalization of Ibogaine in a holistic treatment setting. He visited Gabon in 2016 and was initiated into Bwiti. In 2018, he helped set up Tabula Rasa retreat in Portugal, now one of the leading Ibogaine treatment facilities globally. He has organized Ibogaine conferences in Vienna, Porto, and London. He has a PhD in European philosophy from the University of Warwick, UK. So, yeah, really glad, was very excited to publish this episode. Really, really important topic. As always, show notes on christianyordanov.com. For this particular episode, all you have to do is go to christianyordanov.com/06 and the page will come up. And that's about it. I want to thank you for spending the time to listen to the Connecting Minds podcast. And without further ado, here is our guest, Jeremy Weate. Okay, today on the Connecting Minds podcast, we have Jeremy Weate from Universal Ibogaine Inc. Jeremy, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Let's just do some kind of, background stuff. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you discovered Iboga and Ibogaine?
Oh, yeah. So I have a PhD in philosophy from 22 years ago. Then I fell into consulting, got involved in the dot-com era. Everybody needed a website around about 2000, and the idea was if you don't have a corporate website, your business will die. Then I moved to Nigeria and spent 12 years living in Nigeria and got very interested in different forms of culture and spiritual practice there. And then one day when I was back in London on a London bus with a mate of mine, and we were talking about psychedelics, this was about at least 10 years ago, he said, "Have you heard of Iboga?" And I said, "No, what's that?" And he told me a little bit, and then I was hooked. I did some research. And just the idea of, there being a spiritual tradition that's maybe thousands of years old and has this psychedelic sacrament, I just was really, really intrigued. And I did research, and I met one person, and they introduced me to another person. Eventually, I ended up going to Gabon for an initiation into Bwiti and taking Eboga sacrament. And I was just doing a lot of voluntary work around Ibogaine and becoming more and more interested. And I had the opportunity earlier this year to join the board of an Ibogaine company, and actually, it's starting to merge on to being something I do in the daytime rather than sort of evenings and weekends. And became CEO in June, and absolutely gratified and passionate about Ibogaine medicalization. It's an incredible molecule. It's very different from other psychedelics that we hear about a lot. It has multiple target sites of action in the brain, which do very different things to the classic, serotonin 5-HT2A interactions. So I'm passionate about it becoming medicalized, safely available to as many people as possible, primarily for addiction treatment, but also it has potential other applications in terms of neurogenesis for Parkinson's and so on. So it's very exciting times for us, in the Ibogaine community.
Yeah. So do you feel comfortable talking a little bit about your experience with Iboga, Ibogaine, your actual experiences? And I know I've listened to other folks talk about their Bwiti initiation. I know they're not really allowed to divulge that many details, but would you feel comfortable divulging what you can divulge about what it is like?
Sure. I have no issues talking about it. The first thing to say is, you go to Gabon for a few weeks. You're going to scratch the surface of the surface. Bwiti, the traditions around Eboga, rituals in Gabon are, centuries old at least, and via the pygmies, millennia old. So you go there as Johnny Foreigner. You're gonna pick up bits and pieces. It's Gabon is thought of, or the Bwiti is thought of as, the Tibet of Africa, and it's a bit like going to a Tibetan monastery, like for a few weeks. You're going to pick up that there's an absolutely, I don't use the word lightly, but there is an awesome body of knowledge. So many thousands of people going back so far in time. There's an architecture of the spiritual experience that's evolved there. And it's a gift to the rest of humanity. It's just incredible. Specifically for me, going there, I went to Ibando, which is where a lot of people go. There's a French guy, Tatayo, who's been in Gabon for many decades. And it's a nice entree because, it's not like you're going to a village or whatever and you just don't know what's going on. And what I appreciated just as much as the Eboga experience was just the different, each day you're doing a different preparation. You're doing, you're drinking this foul thing, which is making you vomit. You're being smoked. So you have the sort of canvas thing and you're sitting on top of this flame and the smoke seeping out. You're going to the forest for baptism in cold water and you're taking your first initial Eboga. So every day was, just thinking about it now and it's coming back to me, every day was incredible. So it wasn't just, and this is a really important point, I think, it wasn't just about the Eboga. It was about, slow immersion in a culture which is very deep, very old, and very wise. And then the Eboga experience itself, sort of, a week in, was incredibly intense. And again, it wasn't just the Eboga; it was the Bwiti music is absolutely incredible. The Bwiti harp and
oh yeah, I know it.
The sounds of Bwiti music sort of transfigurative of consciousness alone. I don't know. Since that experience, you do something like that, and you open yourself up to it. You have a tie with Gabon for the rest of your life, basically. So
Mm.
whatever I do with Ibogaine, it has to always look backwards and forwards to support to Gabon, whether or not the Ibogaine is sourced in any way from Gabonese Tabananthi Eboga is irrelevant. It's the source culture of Ibogaine, and yeah, it's absolutely incredible experience. Specifically, the trip itself, for me, it's always feels ancestral. It feels like you're connecting to lineages that you don't even know about. When I was in Gabon, I had a very full visual of a samurai warrior. I have no links with Japan, genetically or otherwise, but there was a samurai warrior kneeling and smiling at me. And oftentimes for me, I mean, everybody's experience is different. I see in very visual quality people I assume to be from the past, and they're smiling. It's like, you've come. Hi, welcome to this frequency. The very first time I took a Eboga was in the UK, and it was like sort of seeing a stack of photographs and of faces, and just like that speed of faces going past. I have no idea who these people are, but again, I just got the sense that these are souls from some ancestral realm.
Wow. And what is the receptivity of the folks there in Gabon to us foreigners going there and kind of initiate me, please? What's their attitude to us?
I think very, very benign, very positive. It needs all the support. Bwiti needs all the support it can get. There's internal opponents of Bwiti within Gabon. People of a Christian evangelical bend who just see this as like stuff from the past that should be banned. But at the same time, there are powerful advocates for Bwiti in politics. But yeah, in general, my experience was it's profound. It's like you're being initiated into something really deep, and it's really serious. And so people are welcoming, but also very serious about what you're doing. You're not going for some crazy experience, or it's a spiritual practice and a spiritual technology that you're being welcomed into, but you have to be very serious about your preparations and your intentions and motivations.
Yeah. And I've been reading a lot about on various boards and listening to podcasts about the actual experience of Ibogaine. It doesn't seem like it's a very pleasurable experience, though long term it's a rewarding experience. So it definitely it's not for the pleasure seeker. Would I be correct in assuming that this experience?
Yeah, if I think about that personally, would I like to take Ibogaine again? Well, I'd have to spend a year getting ready for it now, because I know what a big deal it is. So yeah, it's physiologically, it's a heavy thing. You have ataxia, so you can't really move your body. You're sort of almost like body paralysis. And if you need to get up, for the bathroom, you open your eyes and everything's spinning, and there's like fire lights. It's a bit like the light from a fire that just goes out of the grate, these orange, yellow, and they're just swirling, and you don't know which way's up, and you're kind of crawling to the bathroom, and you just want to lie down again. I mean, it really hits the body in a much more powerful way than classical psychedelics. So yeah, it is not a recreational fun experience. It's a complete reset of your central nervous system. It's ego death. It's going into the ancestral realm. But yeah, you come out of it, and you're because of the strong physiologically and in terms of the brain, because you're getting increased neuroplasticity. Because basically, Ibogaine, the molecule, once it interacts with the brain, it stimulates the production of GDNF, glial cell-derived neurotrophic factor, which is sort of like the brain's support system. If there's damage, then these helper cells just go into hyperdrive. So the production of new neurons, dopamine neurons, it just goes off the scale. Anyway, the end result experientially is that you feel like you've got a new brain. You feel, you've got a sort of a brain of an adolescent, where you're just so much more receptive to new information. And that stays with you, because what happens with Ibogaine is when you consume it, it metabolizes into noribogaine. And noribogaine stays in the fatty tissues for months, up to 3 months. So you've got this almost like internal or endogenous microdosing system. And the noribogaine itself is producing GDNF. So it's like, you've got this internal microdosing system, which is increasing your neuroplasticity. So it's really good period after Ibogaine to not go home, not go back to the family and to the work situation. But if you can really organize your life, that you spend a month or 2 months after Ibogaine, this is if you're coming from an addiction background, if you can spend a month or 2 months in an aftercare facility or somewhere in nature and just retuning yourself, like looking at the dewdrops on the leaves and the sunrise, and just appreciating being there in the world, and getting back into having a body and sensing, the realm of the senses and the delights of sensuous experience. It's like you're really recalibrating what it is to have senses and perceive and be in the world. And then just to play. So many people who've suffered from addiction, as we know very well now from the work of Gabon, Weate and others, they've suffered through repeat childhood trauma. And, the childish, playful, curious part of them got splintered off through this experience. And it's about reintegrating play and enjoyment into your world. So it's really important not to do serious stuff and serious work like earning money and whatever, and dealing with the things that used to trigger you before, immediately after your Ibogaine experience. And unfortunately, people that do Ibogaine and then just go back to work and go back home, they can relapse because the neurophysiological reset lasts for a few months, and then you're back to how you were, basically. And, there is an aspect of the Ibogaine community where people just take Ibogaine every year or every 6 months. And in a way, that's a bit disappointing and a sort of misuse of the molecule. You should do Ibogaine maybe once or maybe twice, and really, work in a therapeutic setting to restore yourself back to the pre-addicted state, and for that to be, your setting for the rest of your life, basically.
Yeah. And we'll get into, talking a little bit about the addiction stuff and the treatment process. But before that, it was interesting that you talk about this GDNF promoting neurogenesis. What do you think of? I think it's a relatively new trend of folks microdosing with either the root bark or Ibogaine or something, the total alkaloid extract. What do you think? Do you think there's any benefits? And could there be any benefits outside of addiction, for example?
I was just looking. I've got my little bottle of Eboga here, which I microdose from. I don't know where it's gone now. I think you have to be careful, precisely because Eboga tincture, which I do have somewhere here, it stays in your system. I don't think it's similar to microdosing psilocybin or LSD or anything. I think you have to be careful with it. I do microdose, but I'll do it for a week and then leave it for a few months. And It's just because it does stay on board. So you don't need to, I don't think it's going to ultimately be a long-term protocol, personally. Yeah. There have been anecdotal research with microdosing Eboga for Parkinson's disease, which has been effective in the sense that if you combine Eboga tincture with the traditional conventional Parkinson's medicine, which is called Sinemet, well, basically what happens is if you have Parkinson's and you take Sinemet, it effectively, to my understanding, stops working and being effective after a while. But somehow, and we don't understand the interactions, but the Eboga sort of recatalyzes and reactivates the Sinemet. So maybe in the case of, neuro damage in one way or another. Microdosing may have a better application, but I would worry about long-term microdosing of Eboga just in terms of potential damage to the liver or whatnot. So I'd be careful with it. I'm not against it. I do it myself, but I do it sparingly.
Sparing. And what are some of the qualitative effects that, if any, that you can perceive from it?
Well, don't forget that microdosing, and people do forget this, but Ibogaine was first isolated in France 115 or so years ago, and from the 30s onwards, there was a little tincture called Lamborghini, which was basically available in France, and people took it as a muscle stimulant. And I think that's the area where you find Iboga microdosing useful, is in increase in energy levels, because, and I don't understand the deep science of this, but it does increase the production of ATP in the mitochondrial cell system. So definitely more energy. Also increased sex drive, I would say. It's sort of like an aphrodisiac in low dose or microdose. So if you're feeling a bit sluggish physically, or if your libido is down, I think that's another application of Ibogaine microdosing or Eboga microdosing.
All right, so let's. I think the most important part. Let's talk about a little bit about the treatment process, and what does the treatment process entail for, let's say, someone addicted to opioids, heroin, maybe alcohol, cocaine. What preparations would they go through? What is the treatment process like, let's say, for a week or two at a clinic? And then what is the integration and aftercare like?
That's a good question. Thank you, Christian. I'm a very strong believer in Ibogaine assisted psychotherapy. Very similar in a way to what MAPS has done with MDMA. It's having Ibogaine in the context of going through pre-treatment therapy and post-treatment integration. There's a very good friend of mine who's one of the leading Ibogaine pre-treatment therapists, Anders, and it's basically lining someone up, cracking them open, getting them ready. Accessing deeper levels of intentionality. Realizing the seriousness of purpose. I went back to this, in terms of talking about the Bwiti, but realizing that you're on your knees and you need to be on your knees. Like, I'm ready, I'm desperate, I'm open, this isn't a quick fix, this is a deep fix. I would say optimally 6 1-hour pre-treatment therapy sessions where you're cracking open your relationship to your addiction. You're realizing that you're not defined by your addiction. This is where I think Ibogaine therapy for addiction is sort of like the opposite or the antithesis of 12-step. In classic 12-step, it's like, my name is X and I'm an addict, and you go through the steps. And I'm not knocking the 12 steps. It's just that it doesn't work for most people. It works for, maybe 5 or 10% of the people. But with Ibogaine therapy, it's, my name is X and I'm not defined by my addiction. My addiction is a history that happened to me thanks to childhood trauma, and it's something I'm going to walk away from. So you go through these, sequence of like opening yourself up, cracking yourself open. Then you go and do, the Ibogaine. There's a lot of medical details. I don't need to go into too much detail, but, pre-treatment screening, making sure your heart is in good working order, your liver system, your metabolism is functional. Psychologically, it's not for everyone. So there's quite a rigorous, in the best case, there's quite a rigorous pre-screening, physiological and psychological.
Age ceiling, if there is one? What is the oldest you could be?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I would say rather than being an old age ceiling, there's a young age ceiling. So people in their 20s can often just not be mature enough for it. it's almost like there's the minimum age is if you're 21, 22, and you're a few years into your addiction, you might not be ready for it. You might be wasting the opportunity, or you may well have to come back a few. And this is the experience, I think, of Ibogaine providers. It's just you're not really on top of or got to the bottom of your addiction in your 20s. So I would say, anyone younger than late 20s, they're probably not going to get the most from that experience, and they're probably going to relapse and come back. In terms of old age, as long as your ticker, your heart is in good condition, you're relatively fit. You can be in your 70s or maybe even older. You would adapt the protocol based on your state of health and your age. Some Ibogaine providers are pretty much low dose over 10 days, 50 mgs a day, which is not threatening to any age, I would argue. Anyway, you go through your Ibogaine treatment. Now, there's a big difference, Christian. If you're an opioid addict compared to if you're a stimulant addict. So if you've been on heroin in the last 20 years, you go through your Ibogaine, you're like, oh my God, I'm not having withdrawal symptoms, which is like amazing for someone who's had an opiate addiction problem. It's like, I don't have withdrawal. I didn't think that was possible. This is incredible. Oh my God. It's like a religious experience. It's very common for people to be absolutely amazed that they're free. But then 2 or 3 days later, the sheen of Ibogaine wears off, and it's like, oh, I'm feeling pain, I'm achy, or they have what's called restless legs. And so people who've had a long-term opioid addiction or opiate addiction, getting used to being, without opiates is getting used to the normal aches and pains that, non-addicted humans have, and they're not used to it, and they find it really uncomfortable. And it's like a psychological thing more than a physiological thing. So that's the point where you want to start getting people into their bodies, Kundalini yoga, breath work, meditation, energetic type healings are more important at that stage than kind of verbal narrative stuff. Meanwhile, if you're a stimulant-based addict, cocaine, crack, whatever, it's like even I've seen it, even during the treatment, it's like, I'm ready, I'm good, I can go home, I want to go and play sport. It's like because their cellular energy level is, and alcoholism is a little bit like heroin. It's like you've got very low cellular energy. It's hard to get out of bed, But with stimulant addiction, it's like the opposite problem is just slow down, stay in bed, just go for a walk, this afternoon, So the post treatment depends on what your addiction is, and also the specifics of who you are and your personality. And ideally, you want to have someone for a month afterwards, so that they're just like slowly returning out of the cave to the daylight of normal everyday existence. And I think Universal Ibogaine, the protocol we want to develop, is encouraging and incentivizing people to be able to spend a few weeks out of life post the Ibogaine treatment. And then the ideal is a little bit like 12-step. The ideal, once you've left, is to have a fellowship, like people you can have a Skype with or whatever once a week for the rest of your life, tune in and, that aspect of the fellowship aspect of 12-step, I think, is pretty good, but non-judgmental. And, people fall off the wagon, and that's fine. There's no shame. There's no shame in relapsing. It's great. It's like, okay, you relapse. Yeah, what can you learn from that experience? Yeah, okay, let's have another go round. Probably have to do Ibogaine again, but what lessons have we learned? So even relapse, you can take it as just a wonderful opportunity, not shameful or I failed or, oh God, I'm destined to go back to this. It's just like a really good therapist will get you to see it as a glowing, glistening opportunity to do things better next time.
That's amazing. That's really, it's so kind of refreshing to hear you say that, because a lot of folks that struggle with addiction, there's, that shame aspect, and that's one of the biggest impediments to really overcoming it, isn't it? Just a quick side question. Is the actual journey on Ibogaine music assisted? Do you use the Bwiti music or any like map style playlists?
My personal preference is to do Ibogaine with Bwiti, just because I came through, originally with the experience in Gabon. It's a really good question. We haven't figured it out yet, and I think my current view on it is it's up to the patient. If they've got their favorite music that they want to play that's really personal to them, that's inspiring, then we would play that. Some people just want to put the eye mask on and get on with it, in silence. So I would say there isn't like a sound protocol that's the same for everybody, because it's just such a deeply personal experience. And I wouldn't want to, some people absolutely hate Bwiti music. They find it weird and jarring and disruptive and not calming.
Yeah,
I respect that.
Yeah. I love the Weate music. I actually have a couple of Spotify playlists that sometimes when I'm working, I have it in the background. I love that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I do. It's like being in outer space.
Yeah, because I come from like a techno background. I used to listen to a lot of techno in my 20s, and it almost has techno elements to it. But let me ask you, Jeremy. So maybe for the listeners, I've been reading a little bit about this. Can you tell us? So we know that the root bark, in the traditional Bwiti ceremonies, they eat copious amounts of the root bark, and when many of the clinics use isolated Ibogaine, HCl, and then there is the total alkaloid extract. Can you give folks an idea of some of the rationale why the extract is used, and what are the advantages to using the extract as opposed to the total alkaloid or the root bark for the treatment?
That's a really good question. No, I'm happy to address that. So, to begin with my experience in Gabon, I don't know, I've got a sensitive digestive system, so there's only so much handfuls of this kind of ammonia tasting sawdust that I can put into myself. At some point, they go round in a circle when you're doing it in Gabon, and when it's your turn again, you kind of get spooned it, and then they hold you up by your arms, and they're kind of bouncing you up and down just to make sure it goes down. But yeah, I threw up massively. And so it's not, even though the ritual and the music and the rhythms and the dancing is amazing, it's not a particularly efficient delivery system for the actual molecules, right? However many alkaloids there are in Tabernanthe Eboga. I'm not sure if we're actually sure. It's certainly more than 12, and it might be different alkaloids for different species of the plant. So anyway, it makes sense if you want to have a more efficient delivery system to do some first level of synthesis. So you end up with total alkaloids, which is just like the refined suite of alkaloids, but in a much reduced powder form. Maybe you take a teaspoon or two. Unfortunately, I haven't had that experience. I think if I do go through an Eboga experience again, I'd probably do the total alkaloid, because there's just something mysterious about the entourage effect. As somebody described it, it's sort of like a chord versus playing one string of a guitar. It's like a chord. That kind of harmonics of all the different alkaloids, ibogamine, ibogaline, tabernanthine, all of these do something magical. And so you're much more likely to have a profound spiritual, visionary experience with the total alkaloids. As you go to the next level of synthesis, you're with purified total alkaloid, which is ibogaine, ibogamine, and ibogaline. Some people find that very pukey. In other words, you may throw up, and other people it's just like a train hitting you. It's like a real powerful. It can be visionary, but it's more just like a full-on proper reset. And then, and many providers like PTA because it is very effective in terms of interrupting addiction. But the ultimate end stage is ibogaine hydrochloride, which is the addiction interrupter in its purest form, less visionary, less hallucinations, if you want to call them hallucinations. And I think, in a way, an optimum protocol in the future might be ibogaine HCl to knock out the addiction, And then maybe a week later, you have the experience of the total alkaloid, because you know what people are like. They take something like Ibogaine, and they're kind of not only this. They have two things or two expectations in their mind. One is, I don't want to be an addict anymore, and two, I want to have the visions. I want to have that psychedelic experience. So I think a week later, having the total alkaloid will more than likely give you the return to the childhood trauma and the allowing for it to come up and be released, or going to the ancestral realm, or whatever it is. And then that's a pretty satisfying, that meets those two expectations that people can often have. I also think, just more generally, that we're at the very beginnings of thinking through what an advanced protocol would be. There's been an underground scene for Ibogaine for the last 20 years. There's been a lot of experimentation. There's a lot of wisdom out there. So the idea of, Ibogaine hydrochloride for the reset, and then maybe at the end of your stay, you do 5-MeO-DMT, or you do psilocybin. I'm a little bit... I wouldn't like to say to someone who suffered from a substance use disorder, oh, you do Ibogaine, and then there's all these other psychedelics. And the danger with that is you give persons who've come from a substance use disorder background the idea that the only way they can get well is by imbibing substances. And you've got to do the work yourself, you've got to do you don't need substances all the time to heal, in other words. And there is a bit of a risk that narrative is sort of cropping up. For me personally, psychedelics are incredibly precious, and I don't take them very often at all, because I just take them so seriously. It's not like, oh, this week I'm this week. No. Meditate, do the work, reflect, and every few years, But if you're coming from a substance use background, which I'm not, there is the risk of you falling back into, habitual patterns. So there is more of a requirement of different forms of sacrament of one kind or another. But yeah, just hopefully that gives you a clear idea of the route from a relatively inefficient delivery system of, root bark, total alkaloid, PTA, and then Ibogaine hydrochloride.
Yeah, that's really good kind of overview, Jeremy. Thank you. Actually, I've kind of heard people say, the plants, these plant teachers, they have the spirit of the plant. So the more of the natural form that you can ingest, the more you get the actual spirit of the plant. So some say like the coca leaf, it has the cocaine. People have heart attacks and health problems because they're disrespecting the spirit of the plant. So maybe like for psychospiritual purposes, maybe you're right, the total alkaloid kind of moving the direction of more alkaloids, more of the plant. Maybe that's kind of going to be a more effective way to get those spiritual experiences for people.
Yeah, I think so. There is going to be a move to, producing Ibogaine HCl in the lab from, a chemical precursor. And on the one hand, as CEO of Universal Ibogaine, from a business perspective, I see, okay, yeah, optimize supply chain, reducing risks and all the rest of it. But if I take my business hat off, and I think psychotherapeutically, I think, okay, yeah, I guess it's not the best, but it may be the way we have to go forwards as a kind of widely available medicine. But yeah, I do have a bias in favor of plant-based medicines, psychedelic medicines, definitely.
Awesome. So just I'm gonna try and get some folks to specifically talk about childhood traumas and how they can lead to various issues with like addiction. But could you expand a little bit? Because I listened to someone else talk about Ibogaine, that some 60% of the people that come to him, the root of their addiction seemed to be a feeling of abandonment from the same-sex parent. Could you maybe expand a little bit? What trauma, what childhood traumas can kind of lead to addiction? What do we know?
I mean, obviously there's the there's the obvious traumas of physical abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, and so on. But I wouldn't like to be like either or about trauma. I think we all experience trauma. The birth event is a traumatic event that we all go through. And people can be traumatized by incredibly subtle things that happen when they're, a toddler or whatever. And, nothing like dramatic, like being beaten or something or being sexually abused. So, and I think we all have it. I think, it's not like there's a group of people who are addicted and who went through childhood trauma and then there's the rest of us. I think we're all on a continuum of we all need to heal in different ways. I also think there is clearly epigenetic trauma. There's genetically lineage, passed through the genes. That's been proven in studies on, Jewish populations. But all of us have ancestors who suffered, and sort of as soon as you go into the past, the 19th century, and prior to that, life was tough for people, and so we have the epigenetic lineage trauma. Then we may have other forms of trauma that we don't even understand. So I would say that my I don't make a strong distinction between people that do psychedelics for psycho-spiritual work and people that do it healing from trauma. We're all somewhere in that kind of bubble, and we're all going towards it for healing purposes. We all get triggered. We are all predisposed to snapping back into a reflex, which is not the best version of ourselves, and so on. So, but to your point about same sex, trauma and whatnot, I'm not an expert. I wouldn't be able to speak to that.
And so I suppose we kind of touched on this, but from what I've read, users of Ibogaine or Eboga, their integration process could be months, sometimes years. What is kind of why is the integration process so long with Ibogaine or Eboga comparably to other psychedelics?
Yeah. Well, firstly, it's just the physiological aspect of having Ibogaine on board for a few months. If you take psilocybin or LSD or whatever else, ketamine, it's the molecule is metabolized and out of your system within hours, where it's in your system as Ibogaine for weeks, if not months. So you're feeling slightly different and perceiving slightly differently, and your brain is like highly more neuroplastic than previously. So it's got a long-lasting physiological effects due to its unique metabolic characteristics. But then there is just another level where it's just mysterious that you've touched this vibration, you've connected in a certain way. I think about my experience with the Gabon, and it's like you are changed fundamentally. Maybe it's similar mentally in a way to psychedelics. I'm contradicting myself a little bit because, for instance, if you do psilocybin and you have a sense of the divine that you didn't imagine could exist, that lightness of being that's ineffable. You can't even really talk about it without ruining what it was at the time. So, in a way, ultimately, when I think about it, I think the long term is probably not that different to other psychedelics. If you're going into that psychedelic experience, to quote my friend Anders, with the respect and reverence for the sacrament. So, if you're going into a psilocybin experience and or an ayahuasca experience, and you're preparing yourself with the diet and you're reflecting on your intention and it can stay with you just as long as a Eboga experience or as an Ibogaine experience. Ultimately, the only difference is this metabolic aspect, where you are physiologically and in terms of your central nervous system, you are activated by the Ibogaine for months afterwards.
Yeah, you did say it's like a nervous system reset. Am I correct in saying it? decreases or reduces your dopamine levels to kind of pre-addiction levels. What does that actually mean?
Yeah. So what happens is, going back to the glial cell derived neurotrophic factor, it targets an area of the brain, and let me get this right. I can never fully remember it, the ventral tegmental area. Anyway, it's the VTA, which is near the cerebellum. And then, so that's the kind of engine room of the production of these growth factor cells. And then what they do is they express dopamine. So it's like a sort of input to dopamine production, if you like. And then those dopamine neurons get expressed out throughout the rest of the brain structure. So basically, just imagine, like, visually, you've got an engine room of dopamine neuron production, and then they get distributed from that core area of the brain out through into the frontal cortex and whatnot. And so, yeah, you do have new dopamine neurons, basically. And yeah, that sounds great and amazing. Like you have a central nervous system driven by a brain which has got pre-addicted levels of dopamine receptivity to external stimulus. Fantastic, wonderful. Smell the plants after the rain, and the feeling of your feet on the sand and all of that. And having a strong sense of well-being. But it's a big risk, because if you then get triggered and you go back to your old poison, you don't have the same tolerance to whatever it was, and you're real risk of overdose. So that's, again, where there's a practical sort of guidance, like, be really careful. If you are at risk of relapse, be really careful, because you're not going to be able to take as much fentanyl or heroin as you previously did, because your neurocircuitry has been reset.
And you did say, like the ayahuasca, there's this dietary preparation, so respecting the medicine. And with ayahuasca, it's a very bland diet of pretty much just a bit of animal protein and kind of grains, rice, oats, this kind of stuff. What do patients or clients of the clinics, what kind of dietary restrictions would be recommended to them to prepare?
Well, there's certain things which you really, shouldn't be taking. Coffee, definitely stimulant-based foodstuffs and beverages. Grapefruit juices, you really shouldn't have that. It interacts badly with Ibogaine. I would say that there isn't, to my knowledge, I could be wrong, but there isn't a similar tradition in Bwiti of dietas as you find in South America and the rainforests, in the Amazon. But at the same time, yeah, just eat good. General advice: eat good, healthy, balanced food. Low on the stimulants. No alcohol. If you can avoid cigarettes, then no cigarettes, and all the rest of it.
Awesome. And then, do you eat on the day of the treatment, or do you try to keep an empty stomach?
You've got to keep an empty stomach, otherwise it's going to come back up. I'm trying to remember what happened to me. I didn't eat for hours and hours before, when I was in Gabon, and definitely, you keep the day of the treatment, definitely no foodstuffs.
Yeah. They say, I think that's why they say, eat well to build up strength rather than fasting and kind of limiting foods.
Yeah.
And just another.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, please.
Well, I was just going to say, like in a medical setting, like we're putting forwards with Universal Ibogaine, you do need full medical equipment. You need a defibrillator in case of cardiac issues. You need oxygen. You need to be measuring the oxygen levels in the blood via a pulse ox. You need to have IVs on tap. If there's any issues with electrolytes, you need to be able to pump in electrolytes, potassium to restore balance and so on. You need to be on a 12-lead ECG machine, measuring the heart, and there needs to be eyes on the ECG machine all the time for the first 48 hours. So, to make sure that it's safe, 100% safe, that like no one ever dies, then it's an emergency room procedure for the first 24 to 36 hours. At Universal Ibogaine, a fellow board member, Dr. Alberto Sola, runs Clear Sky Recovery Cancun. He's had 3,700 patients and nobody's died. And that's because he comes from an ER background and knows what to do if something goes wrong. So, yeah, there's just this kind of negative perception about Ibogaine out there, which is, it's cardiotoxic or it's neurotoxic, or people die. Actually, the reality is people on methadone die far more frequently than on Ibogaine. The death rates for methadone are appalling, 1 in 300, I think, something like that. So many people have miserable lives on opioid maintenance. It's just like low sex drive, no pleasure. It's just a grey, monotonous existence. So, like for me, when people come with a negative perception of Ibogaine, especially from traditional addiction backgrounds, where people have a vested interest in 12-step and traditional rehab and all the rest of it, it's like, fine, Ibogaine's coming. It's an extremely powerful tool, which, you should be enthusiastic about because it can be perfectly safe in a medical setting. It will be a very valuable tool to the work you do. And I think that's what's going to happen with Ibogaine, that in the next few years, traditional rehabs, facilities, once it's medicalized in places like Canada, which is where we're focused on, they will just build it in as a tool and have to, adapt, and all to the good, Ibogaine will find itself inserted into different medical settings and, be good for people with addiction in general. So, for me, I view it as a kind of unstoppable force now. Ibogaine went through clinical trials with the FDA in the 90s, and for one reason or another, that got blocked politically. Now it's not going to get blocked because we have this terrible opioid epidemic, in North America, addiction problems and epidemics around the world, crystal meth in Australia and Yaba in Southeast Asia, and all around the world, you'll see different, in the UK, where I'm from, we basically have an alcohol problem, which has been there for decades, Ireland, So it's like around the world, there's different forms of addiction, and we have a status quo of addiction treatments, which are completely ineffective for the most part. And Ibogaine, it's not going to change the world, but it will be a very powerful tool to be inserted into different addiction treatment settings, which will be of benefit to people that go to those places.
Yeah, I've lived in Ireland 14 years and I know what the drinking culture is like there. So, and it's very similar in the UK. But this is actually a question that I meant to ask you at the beginning of the show, and I apologize for forgetting. But when we're talking about addiction, right? This is I'm glad you kind of touched on this topic. We're not, when we say opiate or opioid addiction, we're not just talking about heroin, which is actually a relatively small part of the overall opioid crisis. Can you give folks, and I'll probably insert the details of this into the introduction when I give you the introduction, because this is actually a much bigger problem that guys like you and Ibogaine Universal or Universal Ibogaine are addressing. What is the scale of this opioid crisis, actually?
Yeah, I mean, it's massive in North America, Canada, where we're focused. Our company, Universal Ibogaine, is headquartered in Vancouver. There's an infamous part of the city center called the Downtown East Side. I was there in February, just before COVID hit. And yeah, it's like the film Taxi Driver. It's just people strung out on the street. It's very dramatically visual, and it's very tragic. But that's a kind of skewed image of addiction, say in Canada or in the US. It's moms and dads. It's just anybody. One particular form of addiction which is hidden from view is sports addiction. So in Canada, people play ice hockey, or in America, basketball. High performance athletes, when they have injuries, they can be prescribed OxyContin, opioid based painkillers, and then they get addicted. So yeah, it's a completely different image of addiction, which is below the surface. But it can be, a classic story will be somebody's doing some, in a suburban neighborhood, doing some work on their roof, and they fall off the ladder, and then they have a back injury, and then they go to the doctor, they get a prescribed painkiller, opioid painkillers. And then, then the insurance policy runs out, and they're addicted, and they flip to heroin, and the heroin's got fentanyl in, like it always does have these days, and then their tolerance thresholds to fentanyl goes up, and then it spirals out of control, and multiply that by hundreds of thousands across North America. It's coming to Europe as well. The UK, for instance. There aren't enough warnings around opioid-based painkiller distribution from GPs. It's not the same level as the States or North America, but it's there's at least 500,000 people who are addicted to opiate from my memory of statistics. Yeah, it's something like
Wow.
500,000 plus are addicted to opioid-based painkillers in the UK alone. Don't have the statistics for across Europe, but it may well be similar. Because, just the pharmaceutical lobbying has been effective. Actually, one thing I heard 3 weeks ago was we kind of think, the era of OxyContin and Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, they've been hit by these $1 trillion lawsuits, class actions. And thank God it's finished. We're over, at least in terms of the pharmaceutical drive to distribute opioid-based painkillers like OxyContin. Somebody told me that all they've done is shifted base to Mexico. And so there's been a legal change, which previously to prescribe opioid-based painkillers, it was only anesthetists in Mexico, but now GPs can basically prescribe them. And they've just moved. It's a bit like the tobacco companies, right? They got hit by lawsuits and whatnot years ago, and then they just shifted to the third world or the developing world, Africa and whatnot. It seems like the same is happening. So they're just shifting base to like more weakly regulated jurisdictions to carry on, with the playbook, basically. So, it's, to answer your question, it's all walks of life. There is no one image of addiction, which is like the image. Street-based addiction is one thing, but it's suburban, it's rural, it's everywhere. In North America, it's the epicenter of it, but it's rippling outwards and getting distributed around the world. If you take, I spent some time working in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar and whatnot, and the Chinese-speaking corner of Myanmar, where they produce the yaba, which are these little pills of basically crystal meth, and they lace them with vanilla so that it's tastes nice for kids. And it's just insane, like 12, 13-year-olds, and it's like less than $1 for a pill, and it's crystal meth. And and they churn this stuff out by the millions of tablets for the whole of Southeast Asia. So they have a very particular, and it's now reached Australia and Japan. So they have a particularly evil form of crystal meth addiction distributed throughout, Asia Pacific, essentially. So, I don't know, humans, we've reached, on a macro level, we've reached the end of the game of a certain way of existing on this planet. And we're all suffering because we're out of balance with the planet, and on that level, it's going to take more than Ibogaine, far more than Ibogaine, for us to collectively reset our species and live in balance with the planet, so that we don't have this, adaptive response of addiction.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, it's if trauma is the root cause of addiction, we need to figure out how are we traumatizing ourselves or our kids, and either reduce or address those traumas earlier in life. And unfortunately, we seem to more perpetuate them than reduce them or alleviate them. But that's a topic for another podcast, another person. You're doing your part of the what we can do is address very serious addictions, which are I love seeing folks like you out there doing this kind of stuff, which kind of leads us to what's on your plan now for Universal Ibogaine? I know you're thinking of, I believe, doing some clinical trials and maybe even going public with the company. Tell the folks listening what you're up to. We'll be up to.
So it's very exciting times, actually. Obviously with the Compass Pathways IPO on NASDAQ, capitalism, the markets are really perked up. Compass Pathways is now valued at whatever, 1.3 billion in the last week or so of being, listed
What is
on NASDAQ.
Compass Pathways?
Compass
What is
Pathways
Compass
is the
Pathways?
main company working with psilocybin medicalization. A major stakeholder, a shareholder in Compass Pathways is a Thai. So yeah, they're ploughing a path in terms of being able to raise money and sort of like the prestige, like overcoming this kind of slightly negative view. It began with MindMed in Canada. They were the first psychedelics company to list on a stock exchange, in this case, the Toronto Stock Exchange. So that was a kind of a milestone months ago. And then a couple of weeks ago, Compass listing on NASDAQ, a big American technology exchange. So, it's sort of like corporate capitalism reperceiving psychedelics and seeing that this is the new thing. It's going to be much bigger than cannabis was a few years ago. It's going to be like the internet in a way. It's just going to be a major driver for investment and a completely new sector of the economy. So Universal Ibogaine, in our own way, we are very, very focused on Ibogaine medicalization. We're not looking at any other psychedelics. We're focused on Canada because Health Canada, on the one hand, it's a high quality regulator. The data from clinical trials in Canada is trusted around the world. If you finish phase 2, you can then hopefully, as we plan to, take the phase 2 data and then start phase 3 trials in different countries. So you're fast tracking the clinical trial process elsewhere. But it's cheaper than America. Doing clinical trials in Canada is much cheaper than America. So you end up getting a drug medicalized at an affordable cost rather than, to put a novel drug through clinical trials in America is at least $500 million.
Wow.
Yeah, so we'll be spending a fraction of that. There's a real inertia against novel drug development. Most of the drugs that we deal with when we're sick are like decades old, basically, because of this. To run Ibogaine assisted psychotherapy through phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials in Canada. Once we get the phase 2 data approved by Health Canada, then we take that to run phase 3 clinical trials in other countries. We're planning Australia, New Zealand, potentially Portugal as well. And on the back, once you get the phase 3 data approved by these different regulators, then you can basically set up legal Ibogaine assisted psychotherapy clinics in those countries. We are going to be opening.
Just briefly, what will your clinical trials target? Will it be opiate or other addictions or a mixed bag?
Yeah, IV injecting opioid addiction.
Okay.
Okay. So intravenous opioid addiction. We have to be pretty narrow about that.
And so is that kind of the plan for if you were to expand to other countries like New Zealand, Australia, also that? Okay.
Yeah. I mean, there's a ton of work to be done. Obviously, Ibogaine has application much wider to other different substance abuse addictions. But clinical trials, you have to go very narrow to be successful effectively. So there's a ton more research and development needed in the future years. This is just like the way in, the kind of thin end of the wedge. But Ibogaine for alcoholism, for crystal meth, these are all clinical trials that will also need to take place. But like the major addiction pandemic in North America is opioid based, so it's a good place to start.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And so let's say that goes well. Hopefully, please God, everything goes well. What's kind of the plan for the next? Let's say, so you expect to get into phase 2, phase 3 in the next 2-3 years? Is that a realistic target, or is it a little bit ambitious?
It's very realistic for us to complete phase 2 by mid 2022. It's very realistic. We would start in the start of Q2. We would begin enrolling for phase 2, Q2 2021, and 12 months later, you have a protocol where you basically have 2 people a month going through, and you have 20 people. So it would take about 10 or 11 months. By mid 2022, we should hopefully, best case scenario, have approved phase 2 data and be looking at planning for phase 3. COVID, post-COVID, clinical trials are becoming much more adaptive, a lot more use of data science and real-world data. So we're really hoping that we can have a fast-track phase 3. And by the end of 2024, I think it would be achievable that we get phase 3 data at least archived and going through regulatory review and approval. And by 2020, it's exciting. It's clinical trials is a rabbit hole. There's a lot more involved than you can imagine from the outside, as we're finding out. But I would say it's feasible that by 2025, in 3 countries, we're rolling out legal Ibogaine-assisted psychotherapy clinics. We're starting to look at franchising so that we can scale the model. And I would say by the end of the decade, maybe 10 countries and hundreds of Ibogaine clinics around the world, in Asia, in Europe, in North America, and so on. And that's feasible. That's definitely feasible.
Yeah. What would be the size of a bare bones Ibogaine clinic? How many, let's say, clinicians? Like how many? Like maybe one MD. What other staff and clinicians would that require?
So we're going to be opening an Ibogaine clinic, the first one, early next year, because Ibogaine is legal in the Bahamas. It's been approved by a national ethics board under the Ministry of Health. So we'll be opening Clear Sky Recovery Nassau in hopefully January 2021. And for example, that will be 15-bed. There'll be like a senior psychiatrist who's a prominent Bahamian guy. There'll be someone that is sort of like the MD of the clinic, if you like. There'll be a senior doctor. There'll probably be a junior doctor. And then there'll be more or less a ratio of nurse per patient. So are you back?
I lost you for a sec. Sorry, I lost you for a sec.
Yeah, I think probably me. So to rewind, we're opening. We're going to be opening our first Ibogaine clinic in early next year. Ibogaine is actually legal in the Bahamas. It's been approved by a national ethics committee. So we'll be setting up Clear Sky Recovery Nassau. That will have someone to operationally run the place. It'll have a senior doctor, a junior doctor, something like a qualified nurse per patient type ratio, and then all the sort of operational team like a chef and cleaners and whatnot. But yeah, in terms of optimal clinic size, I would say between 10 and 15 patients or beds. Anything bigger than that, it's just getting too chaotic. And in the era of COVID and post-COVID, it's just too difficult to manage in terms of getting people in and having their test result, their COVID test results and so on. So yeah, I think that would be the model for us. Clear Sky Recovery Nassau, 15 beds would be optimum in terms of, from a business perspective, it makes sense, but also from a kind of customer client perspective, it's not too big and chaotic and too much going on. And outside of the medical team, there will be all kinds of therapists, holistic therapists, masseurs, coaches, and breathwork experts, and all the rest of it. Also traditional addiction counselling. There's a role for that. So, it's sort of like it will. And then, as we develop, we'll be developing our aftercare proposition as well. So, whether you stay in the same place or you go somewhere else on the island, to be determined. The place we're thinking of buying, the owners currently own a tiny little island off the coast of Nassau. So an aftercare facility, which is just like on its own, a kind of island off the coast of Nassau, might be really nice, somewhere where you're just beach and just enjoying good food and walking on the sand in the evenings. Something, like I said, going back to the beginning, where you're just enjoying being in your body and in nature again and going for a swim and stuff like that. It's all good stuff for aftercare.
Yeah, that sounds really awesome. Very, very exciting. I will certainly be trying to be keeping abreast of the developments in, the clinical research. And I was kind of happy to see it in Portugal. Obviously, they've decriminalized pretty much everything except some of these new research chemicals, but Ibogaine is being decriminalized. So just, I suppose, one final question before you can let the folks know where to find you and Universal Ibogaine. But what do you think are the prospects for more of these centers in Portugal? I know there's at least one or two near me here.
Yeah, so I help set up Tabula Rasa Retreat, which is in the Alentejo in Portugal. The owner, Alvaro Franti, is a good mate of mine. He's doing amazing work there. I would love to, I would love Universal Ibogaine to partner or form some kind of alliance with Tabula Rasa, because I just respect the work he does so much. And in terms of phase 3 trials, a dream of mine would be that we take the phase 2 Health Canada data and we go ahead and we engage with the authority, the medical regulator in Portugal, and we do phase 3 trials in Portugal. Alvaro really did a lot of work 4 years ago in planning for clinical trials in Portugal, and then he realized, oh my God, it costs so much. But hopefully there's enough money in the system now to push it forward. So it would be fantastic for Portugal to be the first place that has legal Ibogaine in the next few years. So let's see what we can do.
Yeah. All right, Jeremy. Thank you for spending some time and educating us on this very important compound. And this is such a huge problem we have. That I love seeing guys like you pushing really kind of on the leading edge of this. Tell folks where they can find more information about Universal Ibogaine and where they can kind of find you to follow you on social media, please.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. It's Ibogaine Inc., INC, not INK, ibogaineinc.com. That's the Universal Ibogaine website. Clear Sky Recovery will be the name of our clinic's brand that most people will know. We haven't set the branding up for that. We're working on that at the moment. Twitter, I'm on Jeremy Weate, my handle, Weate, and I interact a lot about psychedelics there. But and if any of your listeners are interested in taking Ibogaine now, just get in touch with us through Universal Ibogaine.
All right, I'll have those links in the show notes, of course. And once again, Jeremy, thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you, Christian. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Connecting Minds. We hope you enjoyed this conversation and found it interesting, illuminating, or inspiring. For episode show notes, links, and further information on our guests, please visit christianyordanov.com. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with someone who might also enjoy it. Thank you for being here.